Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right meditation or concept. These form the core of Buddhist teaching.
Why did he say that I would want the whole of India to get converted to Buddhism?
A, it questions the text. B, it also questions our popular understanding, which are being largely based on the text.
Where did all the books go then? How did we as Indians lose something that was indigenous?
This is a new set of ideas that have come into being, and these ideas are challenging older ideas. Ashoka, in a very popular language, marks the first Buddhist circuit. Buddhism after Buddha is this division between the Hinayana and the Mahayana. So Buddha-centered tourism has become big. That idea came to be seen as a very selfish idea.
In this episode of Discovery of an Author, we are joined by Dr. Shashank Shekhar Sinha. Now, Dr. Sinha is a publishing director at Routledge with over 3 decades of experience across academia, policy, and cultural research. His work sits at the intersection of history, anthropology, and heritage, and he brings a rare depth of perspective to everything that he writes, creates, and touches. And in this episode, we discuss with him a very profound book called Casting the Buddha. Now, from the Mahabodhi temple to Sanchi, Ajanta, and Nalanda, this episode traces how Buddhism shaped not just faith, but arts, politics, architecture, and global connections. You'll get to know certain things about Buddha, about Buddhism, about its spread, about its antiques, about its statues and everything that will surely be very profound, and I can guarantee this is a kind of a knowledge that you would not find anywhere. And if you do decide to listen to this episode in its entirety, then these are some of the amazing learnings that you'll get from this episode. You can pause the screen and have a look at it. And as you know from the last episode, we are introducing something called Comment to Fame. Throughout the episode, you'll see a card pop up. At that moment, what you have to do is to share your thoughts and comments on the specific conversation, and the best comment will get featured on an Instagram handle, and we will give you a personal shout out. And if you do like this episode, and if you found the information valuable and profound, like always, I would humbly request you to please share it, please like it, send it to your friends, your family, anyone you feel is going to benefit with the message and the information that is there. And I hope that you enjoy this podcast. Thank you. So, Dr. Shashank, first of all, welcome to Discovery of an Author. It is truly an honor for us to have someone like you on the show.
Thank you. And I'm really feeling pleasure to have to be on the show and to speak to your audience and the wider constituency.
Thank you. Dr. Shashank, I would like to show the readers Casting the Buddha. Okay, so Dr. Shashank, I'm going to start with something that when I was reading a book, I knew that B.R. Ambedkar was somebody who converted to Buddhism fairly publicly, and he was an advocate for the lower caste as well. But I had no idea that this is what he actually said. This is what I got to know after reading a book. And he said, I want whole of India to be converted to Buddhism. It should not only become a Harijan religion. It is, after all, a universal faith. Now, I want to understand your perspective on this statement. He might have said it as a political tool. He might have said it with any other agenda. But 2 things come up into my head. Do you really feel that it is a universal faith, A? And B, why did he say that I would want the whole of India to get converted to Buddhism? What is your analysis of this statement?
See, this example basically means that the different meanings that Buddhism is taking over a period of time, right? In this case, what we see is that, how Buddhism is being appropriated, or how Buddhism becomes a channel for various kinds of things in post-independence India. In Ambedkar case, he started his engagements in pre-independence India and then goes on till that. He converts, with, around a large number of followers, around close to around 4 lakh followers. This is the year in 1956, right? And as I said, that in that chapter talks about various appropriations of Buddhism. One being how the prime minister is using that Buddhism for statecraft. Second is how it gets connected with diaspora Buddhism, which is basically the Tibetan Buddhism, with the coming of Dalai Lama and settling down in McLeodskant. And the third is Ambedkar, which when it gets connected to identity politics. Now, Ambedkar has had a long engagement with various faiths, basically, before deciding to convert to Buddhism, right? So he has tried various possibilities and combinations. And what he does is basically two things. He, combines with the element of social equality, basically, right? And a social protest, basically. So in case of Ambedkar, he is trying to aspire for equality of beings, basically, right? So that is his ideal, and then he is faced with this caste-based discrimination. So his is a more engaged concept of Buddhism, which talks about, you know, doing away with the caste-based discrimination and more towards equality, basically, right? So therefore, he tries to put Buddhism as a religion which doesn't differentiate, basically, right? And therefore, he, you know, brings in forth basically a version of Buddhism which generally or popularly became known as the Navayana. And interestingly, one of those bits which would be of common or public interest would be that most some of those the Ambedkarite Buddhists also see him as a bodhisattva as well, right? So that is very interesting. So if you look at the houses, many households who are followers of Ambedkar, you would see images of Buddha and Ambedkar both there side by side, right? So if you try and see that the houses of Ambedkarite Buddhists, people who follow Ambedkar, basically, or neo Buddhists or Dalit Buddhists, whichever way we would like to call them, you would see in many cases they have photos of both Buddhas and Ambedkar. So this is a version of Buddhism which is more towards, which focuses more on equality of beings, basically, equality of human beings, basically, right? And doing away with the caste-based
सो
distinction.
अब चाहे कोई अंबेडकर को बोधिसत्व माने, ठीक है, चाहे ना माने, क्या ये कहना ठीक होगा कि जैसे कुछ हिंदू वर्ग में लोग ये भी मानते हैं कि शायद प्राइम मिनिस्टर नरेंद्र मोदी भी कुछ डिवाइन काम के लिए आए हैं, कुछ नोबल काम के लिए आए हैं, शायद उसी सेंस में लोगों ने हो सकता है कि अंबेडकर को भी बोल दिया हो कि बोधिसत्व है, बिकॉज ही इज समबडी हु इज ट्राइंग टू टेक, ही अडॉप्टेड दिस थिंग। मैं ये जानना चाहता था डॉक्टर शशांक आपसे, एक और चीज मैं समझना चाहता हूं, और ये आई थिंक ये फाउंडेशन रखना बहुत जरूरी है, जिससे पहले हम सिद्धार्थ गौतम पे आए। आपको क्या लगता है आज के टाइम पे, अगर मैं इंडियंस की बात कर रहा हूं, मैं अभी वेस्टर्नर्स की बात नहीं कर रहा हूं, आज के टाइम पे अगर कोई भी इंडियन जो पढ़ा लिखा है, जिसको ग्रंथ पढ़ना आता है, जिसको शौक है, वो अगर बुद्धिज्म का पढ़ना शुरू करे किताबें और अध्ययन करना शुरू करे, तो क्या आपको लगता है दे और ही और शी विल फाइंड समथिंग एक्सट्रीमली प्रोफाउंड इन द टीचिंग्स अप टू द लेवल ऑफ वैदिक इकोसिस्टम? जैसे मैं अगर उपनिषद पढ़ूं, मैं अगर एक्चुअल संस्कृत उठा के रामायण भी पढ़ लूं वाल्मीकि की, तो मुझे रियलाइज होगा कि ओ माय गॉड, व्हाट ब्यूटीफुल, व्हाट ब्यूटीफुली दे हैव रिटन, क्या गजब की हमारी दर्शन है। तो क्या बुद्धिज्म या बुद्धिस्ट टीचिंग्स में भी इतनी ही शक्ति है? क्या वो फिलॉसफी भी अगर देखा जाए तो बहुत ही ज्यादा पावरफुल है? अगर आज भी कोई उसको पढ़ना चाहे, इज इट एज ग्रेट इफ नॉट ग्रेटर than the contemporary philosophies of the Vedic ecosystem, or let's say for the Abrahamic ecosystem? Just out of curiosity, I want to know what is your understanding of this.
See, it would be unfair to basically say that this is bigger than that, right? Because they all have their own, as in to use your expression, ecosystems, and all have their own sets of beliefs and prescriptions as well, right? Now, in that context, there are two things. One, you talk about texts, which are both Sanskrit and Pali texts, and then translations, right? So one could, that you have to be an expert to read those texts. Basically, should need to know those, languages to be able to read those texts. So that is something that one has to figure out how to do that. But there are good translations available too. That's about the textual part of it, right? Now, as far as the idea of Buddhism is concerned, and then I'm connecting with this your thing about universal faith, or whatever, uh, I would have two things to say, right? Buddhism, that Buddhism of Buddha's time and how it evolved over a period of time. We could have a longish discussion on that, but here I'll just get you into a short answer to your question. The conceptions of Buddha also changed over a period of time. The conceptions of Buddhism also changed over a period of time. And perhaps that would be a good point to talk about in other sections of if you have any ideas like that. But with Buddha, there are when we read Buddha, and first let me talk about the problems of reading Buddhism, and then come to this Buddhism as what distinguishes it. So the idea is that here is a human being who has died, basically, right? He has attained his nirvana. We don't call, we say that he attained his nirvana. So he got, free from this, he entered into a state of bliss or nirvana, right? And then, he, or what we call enlightenment. So he knows it all, basically, right? And then, there is a chain of existence which is broken, right? Now, when we talk about Buddhism, if we talk about the Buddha's times, right? And I'm talking about 6th and 5th century BC. No, he spoke he taught in the language of in Prakrit, basically, right? And he's trying to basically interact with the wider section of following, beginning with which is basically rooted in the what is called the Gangetic Plains. So what is in modern versions of Gangetic Plains of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. That is the geography he's largely working on, though he has connects also in central India, right, and also in Karnataka. There are some monks which during his time as well who are trying to reach him, from those things. And in the case of Buddhism, so it is in his times, it's mostly remains an oral tradition, right? So what Buddha spoke, what Buddha preached remains mostly in the or remained mostly in the oral domain. Now, the first set of writings are the Pali Canon. So the composition of Pali Canon happens in first century BCE, first in Sri Lanka, right? And then in the second half of first century BC, it happens in India. So that is that. So the first codification or canonization of this faith happens in first century BC, and develops in the early centuries of Christian era or common era, how what it is known now. But so how do we know about it then, right? How do we know about it? We know about it, so in between that there are two things happening, right? One is that people are trying to spread their faith mostly by way of an oral tradition, right? And in the absence of a canon, how do we do that? So immediately after Buddha's death, we have what do we call Buddhist councils. So you have a Buddhist council in what is now known as Rajgir, you have one in Vaishali, you have one later in Patliputra, and then later on there are also talks about other council as well, right? So it is at that council that these teachings began to be compiled, right? So that Buddhism that we know comes through his close disciples, right? That canonized faith that we know comes through his close disciples, right? And later, if you want to discuss it later during times of it, and then it assumes various forms and
Yes.
means,
Yeah.
right? But coming back, and then I come to the part two of it. So here is basically about oral versus text, right? Where Buddhism from converts itself from an oral tradition to into a textual tradition as well. And the second part of it is basically when you are trying to relate it to the times in which it was born. Basically, let's say there are many heterodox sects which are happening alongside what you broadly call the Vedic ecosystem, right? Around that. Now, Buddha has a very interesting approach to the religious beliefs and the social system of his times. So he doesn't come across and very, very, as a kind of a strong crusader, basically, in terms of a direct crusader, right? He questions, the religious beliefs of his time. Certainly, he questions, what was called the caste discrimination. Certainly, but in a very constructive way, in a very, very positive approach. So what he does is basically there are three or four things which distinguish it, right? So one is this whole idea about no deity worship, no rituals, no animal sacrifices, which had become very known, right? Second is by admitting people from various varnas and various classes. Buddha is questioning the varna system in a way in which he said that it is a human made system, right? And the third thing is that as opposed to complex, philosophies or metaphysics, right? Buddha's faith, right, is based on very simple things. It is based on logic, it is based on causality, so this leads to that, right? It is based on human welfare, and it is based on social ethics, right? So you don't talk about very complex religious or metaphysical aspects of thoughts of it. These are very simple set of things. One also thing also that needs to be clarified is that Buddha did not have any divine revelation as such in the way that other religions claim to have, right? So he is meditating on the truth, right? What is the truth? How can we overcome our problems, basically, right? So it is not that he sees a god, right? Like, like the way we understand other religions, and that religion has been passed on through a god. Buddha sees that there are problems in his times, right? And then he meditates about it.
Like a philosopher. Like a
He
philosopher.
meditates about it. Philosopher. He has a lot of wondering, which I'll come to in a while, and he tries various kinds of methods, right? So it is basically a kind of a faith which is rooted in social ethics. It is rooted in simple logic, in humanity, in human welfare. But two other things that one should also say, that it was not a kind of a repudiation of all kinds of discrimination in his time. So for instance, Buddha would not admit, he was not trying to disturb the social order in a big way, right? So he would not admit either debtors or slaves without they have the permission of their masters, debtors unless until they have cleared the debts, or soldiers unless until they have permission from the political masters, right? So he would not do that. He was also not in favor of questioning the family system and the marriage system, right? So he's hesitant about admitting women in the fold, and it comes after tremendous persuasion, right? So it is not as if Buddha is an outright in favor of disturbing this thing, but what he does, he offers a set of things which are what we call as the middle path. So he offers the middle path. You don't have to be extremely indulgent, and you don't have to be extremely ascetic. There is a midway in between these two things, which is the known as the eightfold path. And basically what it does, and this is what Buddha's religion, what came to be known as Buddha's religion is about, is a very simple thing. He talks about four noble truths, right? Which is pretty well known, that the world is full of suffering.
Suffering.
The suffering has
Desires.
desire. It is possible to eliminate, eliminate those desires, and by following the eightfold path. And the eightfold path is a middle path, as I said, between extreme asceticism and extreme indulgence, right? It talks about knowledge, right knowledge, right conduct, right meditation. So right livelihood, right view, right thought, all those kinds of things basically happen. So he's trying to offer a trajectory which is based more on the human aspect of it, more based on social ethics, based on equality of opportunities, basically equality of belief systems, right? And is trying to keep it very simple. No dogmas, no complex rituals, uh, So simple, that you come and join the dharma, right? So that is what Buddha's thing is.
एंड डॉक्टर शशांक, फिर तो इसमें जो निर्वाण जो ये बोलते हैं, निर्वाण का मतलब ही ये हुआ कि आप अगर फोर नोबल ट्रूथ समझ के एट फोल्ड पाथ को फॉलो करके जो फाइनल आउटपुट आएगा, दैट मीन्स यू विल बी समवॉट इक्वानमस, आपको इकोनॉमिटी आ जाएगी, आपको ज्यादा डिजायर्स वो नहीं करेंगे. सो एनहाइलेशन ऑफ डिजायर्स इज व्हाट ही इज कॉलिंग निर्वाणा. नॉट दैट यूल गो टू सम रेल्म वेर इन यू आर ऑलवेज इन सच्चिदानंदा और ब्लिस and you will not take a rebirth. Is this what he means by nirvan, that you live this life with a complete balanced attitude?
No, I'll just read out a one line, and basically
Yes.
I'll just basically let me say which will basically. So I'll just let me see. The goal of Buddha's teaching was the attainment of nirvana or bliss through enlightenment, an experience that could be attained in this life. So this is something that you can
Yeah.
attain in this life, right? That's one. Uh, Literally speaking, nirvana means dying out, blowing out, or extinction. Means the end of something. Basically. Metaphorically, it meant dying out of desire, as you said, attachment, greed, hatred, ignorance, and the sense of I-ness. All things begin with me, right? So, and this is what? So, parinirvana is a term which is used for the death of an enlightened being like a Buddha, right? So, it's about enlightenment, how things work, and as you said, about freedom from different kinds of desire, freedom from I-ness, and all those things that I read out. So, that's what a sense of enlightenment that you've achieved, and it is possible to achieve that in this life is what is important.
When we were having a conversation over phone, Dr. Shashank, you told me something extremely profound, which is just a continuation of what you just said. You said that people have this conception that Buddhist monks are matlab ascetics, ki sadhu ban gaye, ye ho gaye, wo ho gaye. And then you said that we have the relics which says that no, it is not like that. That they were the monks who were actively involved in the daily life, actively a part of the daily ecosystem, and they were involved and not just aloof and ascetics who were somewhere in the mountains and not a part of the daily ecosystem. Would you like to expand this misconception that people have?
There are two things that you're talking about here, right? The first part is about, it is not as if that, monks were, they were, they joined the order, right? But it is not as if, in the way you would use, or understand sannyasa in the other, religions, right? So you are leaving one set of household or a family or a community to become a part of another set of households, family, or community, which is called sangha, right? So sangha is becoming your family, right? So that is that, and then you have to follow the rules of the sangha, which is important for you to be a monk, basically, right? There are certain rules which are laid down by the sangha, which is important, right? So this idea of sannyasa is not just you go to a forest or any secluded place. You are very much a part of society, right? And these monks are working very closely with the society, right? So they are very much located within the society, trying to tell people, trying to apprise them of their teachings, what became to be known as the dhamma, Buddha's dhamma or Buddha's dharma, as you would like to put it in that, right? So that is part one of it, right? That how this monk, the order of monks, is different from the order of monks in anything, right? The second part of the question, I remember, was basically in a discussion regarding, does a different reading of Buddhism, right, offer you fresh insights, right? And here I was talking about, in that, earlier, that very brief discussion we had, when we were talking generally about, Buddhism, was that, and this is what distinguishes my book as well. I'll talk about
Yeah.
in two ways, right? One is that, the dominant way in which you understand Buddhism is through the texts, right? That is how we have understood. And the dominant way in which Buddhism has been understood is as a philosophy, right? Okay, here is a text, and this is what it preaches, or this is what the Buddhist philosophy is like, right? That is the way. And I was very happy that when the jury of historians awarded this book, they talked about how the book uses a different set of sources to study Buddhism, to study religion, basically, right? So that is what it studies, right? Now, what it does and how does it arrive at a different reading of the text? So the texts are basically, in a way, we call it, I'm using very broadly. It's a theoretical part. I'm writing a text. It has a theoretical application, right? And it has a element of preaching as well. So one cannot say in confirmly say that these teachings which were being put forth in the text, being put forth in the text, were universally applicable. Some would believe half of it, some would believe half of it, some would believe full of it, somebody would say interpret text in different way, right? So one is more about how it is preached, right? But when you talk about the kind of sources that I talk about, archaeological remains, you have the monuments, you have the artifacts, you have coins, you have seals and all those kinds of things. There are material evidences which say that there are things which were in practice, right? So one is as it is being taught, and one as it what was happening at the ground level. So that is what differentiates it, this book, right? Using a different text of approach, basically.
Yeah.
Now, when you look at that, so if you go by the text, there are certain set of behavioral patterns which were prescribed for the monks, and they have to be that, right? So let me just talk to you about two broad things. One is that the monks are, and this is how it came to be, have popular assumptions. One is that the monks are, in the popular understanding, the monks were people who were more concerned with spiritual pursuits, right? So you're concerned mostly, you meditate, you concentrate, you think about ideas, you work with society, but the ideas that is these are more spiritual pursuits, no material pursuits, right? So who takes care of the material things? So the material things, it was assumed, would be taken care of by the lay followers or others, right? So somebody is constructing a stupa, somebody is constructing an image, somebody is giving donations. So those are the people who are taking care of the material aspect, right? Now, so these are the kind of dichotomies that you arrive at from the reading of text, right? And there is one scholar called Gregory Chopin. He talks about all these aspects, and how do you read the inscriptions and how do help us arrive at different understandings. And I'll give you 3 or 4 examples, right, from different contexts. If you look at the context of Sanchi, right, and this is true of other Sanchi or Bharot, the inscriptions that you have, they tell you that the monks and nuns were actively involved in setting up of stupas, and later also images, when the images came into being, right? So they are very actively involved with the constructions, basically, right? Also with the relic cult, because the relic cult was also believed to be something which is concerned more with laity, right? Here in the case of Sanchi, what you see is there is an evidence, which has been revealed, by a scholar named Julia Shaw and the team, basically, who talk about that, when you look at the wider surroundings of Sanchi, right? Then you see there are 17 dams, irrigational dams have been revealed, and the earliest of which dates to the time of when the stupa was being constructed, right? So then what do you come across? You come across that in the case of Sanchi, these monks are involved in providing the irrigational services to the villages in the surrounding.
Yeah.
And why it is important in Sanchi about irrigational, why it is very important, because Sanchi is becomes a hinterland for Vidisha, which had become a very flourishing urban culture, right? So Sanchi is now, so, and the Buddhist monks are using this material services to bring people, to attract more followers, naturally, just as they also do. And again you see in Sanchi and other places as well, that they are also appropriating popular cults like the cults of Yaksha, cults of Nagas, right? So Even in Sachi, you come across those two, three things. Let me take you to bit about Ajanta, right? And in the case of Ajanta, from the inscriptions that that have been brought forward, what you get to know are two, three things. One is that Buddhist people or the Buddhist monks also have property, wealth, basically. And they are using that to construct caves. So they are sponsors of the caves, which are being constructed. They are sponsors of the painting as well, which is being done in the Ajanta caves, right? And what also comes across is that they come across as concerned sons who are worried about their father, their mothers, their parents, right? So they are praying. So whatever donations they are doing, they are praying that may our continue to remain in a state of bliss or continue to remain in the health. So there is a concern for the family and the household as well, right? So as I said, they are providing irrigational services, which are material services. They are getting in, they are sponsoring stupas and and relics, they're propagating the relic cult. They are here, they are concerned sons, they are sponsoring caves, so lots of things. And there are also evidences to suggest that they had some association with setting up or supporting trade networks and as well, right? Some scholars also try to link them, basically with some association, not so direct, basically with wine trade or liquor trade, things like that, but so what you come across here is that they are very much a part of this society, and how a different reading, which is inscriptions, so these don't come, you don't come across these in the text. So the text, reading of the text based on the reading, because text talks about ideals, this is what you need to do, so they are prescriptive, as opposed to what, and this remains talk to you about the practice, what was happening. So then the monks come across as different kinds of things.
Yes.
And certainly, one more thing that I like to talk about here is that they also, not only monks, but if you look at basically the other part of it, which is basically that many of those divisions that we have made out, right? Like one very dominant framework of understanding Buddhism after Buddha is division between the Hinayana and the Mahayana,
Mahayana. Yeah.
right? So one is a lesser vehicle and one is a greater vehicle, right? Now dominantly and popularly it is understood that in Hinayana you don't have image worship, that you treat basically Buddha as an arhat and as an enlightened being. You don't have image worship, you worship Buddha in terms of mostly symbols, basically, right? So you would see footprints or a chakra or those kinds of things, right? And it is, and again, the popular way to understand Mahayana is those people who belong to a bigger cycle, and who belong to, who worship Buddha through images, basically, or worship Buddha in a human form. Now when you look at the inscriptions, basically, or even sometimes, and when I say, when I do my reading of the text, it is not as if that I'm completely focusing on only archaeological remains. In this text, basically in my book, basically the archaeological remains are in conversation with the text, basically they are having a conversation with the text and adding things which are not basically being said in the text, but also trying to say where there are points of convergence as well, right? Or or points of divergence as well, right? Or how they offer about new reading of the text, right? So here we see that when you talk to, when you look at this, so one part is very obviously settled through the text itself, that both Fahian and Zhuangzhang, they both talk about both the monks of both the Hinayana and the Mahayana order staying together.
The Chinese travelers you're referring.
I'm referring to those Chinese travelers, so both of them talk about that, how these two people were this thing. And when you look at, the inscriptions, you see that, both were involved with the image worship. The Hinayana and the Mahayana, they were both involved with the image worship. And to look at again inscriptions from, Ajanta, there are inscriptions in cave number 2 and 10 and 22, I believe, or 26, and I'm forgetting which this thing, but two inscriptions from two caves, where they talk about this binary melts away. So one is basically, belonging to a Hinayana order, but sponsoring the construction of an image, basically, right? So this binaries, get dissolved when you look at these inscriptions. Likewise, in Ajanta paintings, the themes that the stories they tell are basically related to the Hinayana tradition, but they assume, forms which are related to the Mahayana, the later phase of the caves in Ajanta. And this is one very interesting part. When you go to Ajanta, the tourist guides will tell you, okay, these are the Hinayana caves and these are the Mahayana caves, right? And that is one of those very different way or popular ways of looking at Ajanta. But when we see that these distinctions don't hold so valid, so A, it questions the text. B, it also questions our popular understanding, which have been largely based from the text. And this is where, these kind of things lies.
Dr. Shashank, there is very, when I was reading the chapter, so there is this one line which says, when the relics are seen, the Buddha is seen. And this was said by Mahindra when he was in Sri Lanka, who's Ashoka's son, when he was talking to the king. Can you explain what is the meaning? And I then want you to come to the importance of relics and what happened after the Buddha died. So let's start with when the relics are seen, the Buddha is seen, the importance of relics, and what really happened after the Buddha died.
This is a conversation. This thing is extracted from a conversation between Mahendra, who's Ashoka's son, and who is gone to Sri Lanka, Ceylon, basically to propagate Buddhist teaching. So he's having this conversation with the king of Ceylon, right? And he says, Ki, I have stayed here for a very long time, right? And if I have stayed here for a very long time, I'm missing Buddha, seeing the Buddha. To which the king gets puzzled. The king says, but Buddha died long back. He's in, this is an incident which is, related to the third century, right? Third century BC, not eight. So third century BC. This is Ashoka's time, right? Now, this incident is third century, and Buddha has already died by then. There are, couple of centuries have passed between Buddha's death. So the king looks puzzled. So he asks Mahendra, what do you mean by that? Buddha to the great, Lord died too long back. Why do you say that you are missing seeing him? And then then it comes to it that, what he's referring to is about the relics of Buddha, right? Now, what is it about the relics, basically that become important, and why do you see that? So we have something called a Tri Ratna in Buddhism, basically very dominant that, everybody knows about, which is the Buddham Sharanam Gacchami, Sangham Sharanam Gacchami, Dhammam Sharanam Gacchami, right? So Buddha is the historical Buddha, right? The human being. Sangha is the order of monks, basically, and nuns, and dharma is the teaching, or dhamma is the teachings, right, of Buddha. So these three ratnas, out of which Buddha has passed away from the scene, right? As a human being, he ceased to exist now. So then what do we mean? So this is one of the ways in which the post-Buddhist times tries to appropriate the idea of Buddha and reconceptualizes as well. So then if Buddha is gone, how do we relate to Buddha? So the relics, Buddha's body parts, right? And the relics are basically three different categories. Category one is his body parts, things that his cremated remains, right? Bones, nails, or whatever. The second thing is basically things that he used, basically, right? So his begging bowl, his robe, in the pot in which his ashes were collected, even Bodhi tree becomes a relic, and later stages, the images become relic in themselves as well, right? But we are still in the first couple of stages, right? Where body, when things which are body parts or objects which are used by Buddha have attained a big force now. and they are seen as symbolizing the living essence. They are seen as the living essence of Buddha, right? And so if you don't have Buddha, if you have the relics, basically, then this is basically the essence of Buddha that you have, right? So in many stories you would hear out, there is a fight about relics, basically. So when Buddha dies, there are armies, which are basically coming, and then trying to fight. They come to Kushinagar, gherao it, and try to take away the cremated remains, and they are, this is at which place. And this is a scene which is depicted in Sanchi very beautifully, and many other places. The war of relics, right? And eventually a Brahmin called Drona, steps in and divides them into 8 parts. So these were, and they were basically interned in stupas. So these were the original 8 stupas, as they call it, which, as the some of the texts say, that Ashoka opened this, at least 7 out of 8 stupas, and then distributed the relics and constructed, what is according to the text, say around 84,000, stupas or something like that, right? Or something on those figures. Now, obviously, that figure nobody has confirmed, but obviously that's a way of saying. So the relics have acquired the same status as Buddha, as in terms of they signify the living presence of Buddha, right? So this is what, in the post, Buddha times, there is a new way in which they conceptualize with the idea of Buddha, which is whole about relics. And then when stupas are, created over these relics, they represent the Buddha also in a larger metaphorical sense.
You speak about Ashoka. After reading a book, I got to know two things about him. Neither did he converted to Buddhism very fast, nor was he in the order. There's a story of him saying that he before Buddhist he was Chand Ashok. After Buddhist adoption, he became dharmic. So explain why Ashok did what he did with respect to Buddhism, because I know that he plays a very instrumental role in spreading this thing across the Asian continents and countries. Not many people give him that credit. So I want to understand what motivated him to adopt Buddhism as his central strategy, philosophy, whatever you want to call it, and then actually accelerate. What have we found from his rock cut edicts to corroborate what he's trying to do?
There are, I would say there are 3 phases broadly here in this context. Ashoka's engagement with Buddhism, there are 3 phases, right? So the first phase is where he says that, it's been a long time since I haven't been to a Buddhist site, by a Buddhist site. By Buddhist site, I don't mean, like an archaeological site, right? But, place, inhabited by monks, and, where Buddha is revered. So that is the first set of things. So there is an element of nostalgia that he's been going there. He's a upasaka. Upasaka is a lay follower. He's not a monk or an, right? Now, obviously, things have, gone, changed after the Kalinga War, right? But to say that the Chanda Ashoka becomes the Dharma Ashoka is immediately is wrong, because he takes a bit of time, basically. So obviously he's going through a transformation, no doubts about that, Ashoka, but that he engages, properly, and he doesn't become a full. He remains a king at the end of it, trying to regulate. And interesting part is there are 3 parts, as I said. So the first part is there where he's talking about, very simple engagements, of a lay Buddhist, that I haven't been to this place, let me go to this place, and he's, being nostalgic about it. The second part is when he, goes to this, yatras, to sites which are closely associated with the Buddha, and erects pillars or, temples there. So he goes to Lumbini, erects a temple there. He goes to uh, Gaya, Bodh Gaya, and erects a pillar there, which is again something which is slightly debatable, because it doesn't have the characteristic modern policy or any inscription. But it is believed that he went to all the sites. Sometimes we have very direct evidence, sometimes we do not have very direct evidence associated with the Buddha and beyond that, right? So this is his yatras, basically the pilgrimage, as he would go. And in the process of doing that, he marks them, right? In the third phases, there are 2 parts. First part that he talks about, that Buddhists should read these texts and things like that, right? That these kind of texts. So he is getting into prescription mode, that you should read this, these have been available, these kind of things, or and then the final phase is when, which is referred to his schism edicts. Schism means, basically where the faith is, on the verge of breaking down, or breaking into parts, basically, or this thing, which you have seen, at Allahabad, you have seen at, Karachi, you've seen at Sarnath, basically. So in the schism edicts, he talks about, he's taking control, right? And he is issuing a warning to the monks that if you are trying to do this, you will be penalized. So here is a king, which you rightly said, has a very striking journey. He never becomes a Buddhist, but his engagements with Buddhism happen in such a way that from a mere follower who is more nostalgic about, not seeing, to one who is being prescriptive, that used to read that, to one who is now taking control of the Buddhist Sangha. So he's controlling the Sangha. He's saying that, if you do these kind of things, then you will be penalized. You'll be, from monks, you'll become non-monks, right? So he is basically trying to talk about, penalties, basically, or penal, being penalizing them. So very interesting trajectory, that, not, being a Buddhist himself, but he's controlling the Buddhist order, right? And also saying that if you try to, create a break, or divide the Sangha, you'll be penalized. And he also appoints special officials to look after that, right? That these kind of things are maintained. So a very interesting example of a king whose engagement with Buddhism is throughout his life remained mostly in terms of, not mostly, upasaka. He remained the lay follower, but then he controls, from being just a lay follower, he starts controlling the Sangha, right?
And that is what we clearly understand from the rock cut edicts as well. But
Absolutely.
I think people obviously couldn't have said anything to him. A, he was the king and he was supporting financially. He eventually was propelling the Buddhist cause, right? So nobody could say anything to him.
He has a, he is obviously, one of, there are two three different forms in which he's supporting it. One is that, that he's earmarking the territory, he's constructing monuments. So he was the one, if we were to use, till the time that we have more, archaeological finds, we can say that, his reign is associated with the monumentalization of a faith.
Yeah.
So, from intangible to acquiring tangible forms, in a big sense, basically, in a more systematic way, if I were to call it, right? His is the reign when you are trying to control the Sangha as well. His is the reign when you are sending, Buddhist missions to different parts of the subcontinent, right? So Ashoka is involved, and his is the reign which, marks, as it is said, he is covering the whole of the subcontinent with the stupas, right? So his reign is very phenomenal in the career of Buddhism in India, right? So he, on all directions, as you rightly said, on all counts, he comes across as a big patron of, a royal patron. Obviously, he has resources, he has control, he has the political control, he has the resources. So, but he spreads it, in a big way. It is also said that during his reign, a council of Buddhist council was held in Patliputra. So, lot of things are happening. Missions are being sent to. So the faith is spreading, controlling the faith, erecting monuments, to earmarking Buddhist circuit. In a Buddhist circuit, I'm using in a popular sense. Creating, earmarking places associated with Buddhas. Lots of
Yeah.
things.
Now, Dr. Shashank, I come to a very important aspect. Now we'll come to the phase two of the discussions, wherein I want to understand the evolution of Buddhism, the various sects that start developing. I am in a quandary right now. On one hand, I do understand the core teachings of the founder of Buddhism. And I have also now known, after reading a book, the evolution of various philosophies, which basically incorporated so many elements that had nothing as far as my understanding, to do with the original philosophy of the founder, right? So I want to first start with explain the evolution of Mahayana, because in the Mahayana we see for the first time the concept of bodhisattvas. So you start with what is the bodhisattvas and how the Mahayana came into being, and then from there we'll go to Vajrayana, Tantra, and other aspects also. So let's start with Mahayana, the evolution, and the concept of bodhisattva. What is the concept of bodhisattva?
Uh, there are three, four elements of this part, basically. Mahayana, let me just first say what it means. It means a greater vehicle. So it's a much larger cycle, the greater cycle. Now, the first clarification that needs to be made, that it is not as if there are two divisions of people who are calling them, one is calling themselves Hinayana, one is calling themselves Mahayana. So Mahayana is the term the followers of a new set of ideas adopted to differentiate themselves from the other existing traditions, right? So more than basically, so the people who moved on to the new set of ideas use this term to differentiate them from many other existing traditions, right? So within Buddhism there are 18 nikayas, basically, or sects. So there are multiple kinds of divisions within Buddhism, basically, or sects within Buddhism. Mahayana comes into being in the early centuries of Christian era, and this is an idea which in a way brings in a new conceptualization of the Buddha also, right? So what was there are two, the starting point of this kind of a sect was that it was said that Buddha, there were Buddhas before Buddha, right? Bodhisattvas before Buddha, or Boni Buddhas before. And it is said, that, and it is believed that when Buddha was born, he said that I am the last of the order to be born, basically, right? So it is said that, before Buddhas, there were Buddhas, right? And, some traditions talk about, Buddhas before him. Now, if by that logic, by extension of that logic, it was said that, okay, if there are Buddhas before Buddha, then there would be Buddhas inhabiting the contemporary universe or contemporary times, and there would be Buddhas who would also be in future, right? If there are Buddhas before the Buddha, the human Buddha, there'll be Buddhas in our times as well, and then would be Buddha. And the second part of that was, so by extension of that logic, basically, there would be Buddhas living in those times as well,
Yeah.
right? But these Buddhas, which were born or which came into being, the concept of which came into being, after the death of the Buddha, which primarily came to be known by the name of Bodhisattvas, were different from those who were different from Buddha himself, basically. So, alongside this idea that if there are Buddhas before Buddha, there should be Buddha now, and there should be Buddhas in future as well, came another idea, which was looking the cycle in terms of a larger dynamic. And then what they were seeing is that, it's they said that, oh, with the coming of the Buddha, the cycle of existence has been broken, chain of existence has been broken. So what now? So now the faith cannot cease to exist, right? So new ideas come into being in all kinds of faiths or religions, basically. So this bodhisattva idea comes into being, and this bodhisattva idea is different from in two different two three different ways, as well. One is that this idea links it up with present and future, now the new concept of bodhisattvas. And it is said that because the chain of existence was broken, so what now? Is it not that people are not capable of attaining nirvana? Yes, people would be capable. So the old idea that you cease to exist after becoming and having achieved enlightenment, right? After having achieved enlightenment, you become an arhat, and that is the end of it. That idea came to be seen as a very selfish idea, right? And the new bodhisattvas that come into being now are bodhisattvas who are seen as epitomes of compassion, kindness, and virtue. And these bodhisattvas, or the wisdom beings as they were called, are going to wait till even the last set of creatures or beings in this universe attain their nirvana. So in the first case, or before the coming of bodhisattvas, we say that with the coming of nirvana, things have ended. No more nobody. The person who perfected that nirvana attained that nirvana. Who tried to achieve the nirvana attained it. Here they are talking about everybody attaining nirvana. All living beings, all living forms trying to attain nirvana. Basically, and the bodhisattvas will wait till they have all it, because out of compassion. Now, how will they do that? That is interesting, which is that with the coming into being of Mahayana, this idea about transfer of merit becomes more popular. It is not as if it did not exist early, right? There are elements, basically of inscriptions reveal that there are, in some incipient form, the idea of transfer of merit existed earlier as well, but it became very popular with the coming into being of Mahayana form of Buddhism, right? Now, what does that mean? That the bodhisattvas can transfer all the merit they have earned. They are very compassionate beings, so I will transfer my merit to someone else, and I'll wait for my Buddha, right? So they are now called Buddhas in waiting. So they have decided not to achieve enlightenment till every living creature in this universe attains nirvana. So the compassion, the kindness, that element takes over,
But
right?
but but when Siddharth Gautama, the Buddha, had said that after me there would be none, then how come these bodhisattvas are in waiting? Even if everybody becomes enlightened, वो तो फिर भी नहीं बनेंगे ना बुद्धा, क्योंकि सिद्धार्थ गौतम ने मना कर दिया कि मेरे बाद है ही नहीं.
See, again, as I said, it is believed that it was said that,
अच्छा,
right? It's
ओके,
believed it is said,
ओके.
but then within the text, there are different ways in which, faith, conceptualizes the order, like, as I said, that if, there is no, Buddha after the death of the physical person, people invest a meaning in the relics. So the relics become a living essence,
Yes, got it.
right? And now, the as you centuries pass by, people negotiate the orders in different ways, basically, right? So one side, and that is why I said that this is a new set of ideas that have coming into being, and these ideas are challenging older ideas, right? And then saying that that is an idea which is a smaller vehicle, here, more people should become enlightened, right? Why should only a definite number of people become, who have
Yeah.
meditated, and then so only people who have meditated and can become Buddha. But here they're talking about a larger cycle. More beings, living beings can become Bodhisattva. So ideas continue to change. Basically, conceptions of Buddha continue to change, right? And the new set of beings who are called as Bodhisattvas are now, what in popular terms, they are not, exactly like, I'm saying, but in popular terms they call Buddhas in waiting. Now, Buddha would symbolize that, enlightenment. Once you have attained the enlightenment, you become the Buddha.
Yeah.
So they are deferring, or they are delaying their enlightenment till others also do that. So different ways in which different ideas are changing over a period of time.
Now, Dr. Shashank, another thing that really shocked me. Okay. And I want you to explain this. So let me tell you what you told me. Then I researched, I also read it. So in Nalanda, there is a temple called Tilya Bhairav Buddha. And when you told me over phone that somehow they have mixed the concept of Buddha with that of the Hindu dharmic concept of Bhairava or Shankara, and his entire image is in the meditative form, it is completely black. I was shell shocked. This is something that I would have never imagined. I had no idea this existed, that there exists a place in India wherein Buddha is combined with Bhairava, which is a form of Lord Shiva. So this leads me now to Vajrayana. And please tell me, how did Tantra and all these elements started integrating within the philosophy of Buddhism? And I also want you to explain me the concept of taras, the Shakti, because even when I read it, It was profound, Dr. Shashank. So we can start with you explaining more about the Tilya Bhairava Buddha, and from there explain us the evolution of Vajrayana, Taras, Shaktism, Shaivism, Tantrism into the Buddhist order.
Go the other way around because it will help us understand it
Okay,
better, basically.
okay,
Right?
okay.
So what you see is that during the Gupta times, which is the third to sixth century, CE, Common Era, and more importantly during the Pala times, which is around 8 to 12 centuries CE, right? During the later Gupta's times, the element of there are several things coming into being, right? So you have this idea of temple based sects, which is basically, so you have the Vaishnava sect which is developing, the Shaiva sect which is developing, so and then pantheons, so in the Vaishnava pantheon you would have Lakshmi, you would have Vishnu. In the Shaiva sect you would have Ganesh and Kartika as Skanda, whichever way you would want to call it, Parvati, so these two text sects are developing. Plus, what you see that the influence, there are two other things which are also developing. And then one of the Shaiva part, and there's one other thing which is developing is this idea of a Shakti cult, right? So the Shakti cult is, in very popular, let me explain to you in very simple terms. It says that, the gods are transcendent, right? They are, have their own affairs, they are involved with that. So if they have to be awakened, you have to approach the consort, the female consort. So if you have to approach Shiva, approach Parvati. If you have to approach Vishnu, you have to approach Lakshmi, right? So the idea that comes into being is that the gods have to be awakened to them, and then the Shakti cult takes over, and then it becomes big, basically, right? And this Shakti cult also not just has basically the Durgas, the Parvati, or Lakshmi, but also other deities also become a part of it, and it has certain regional manifestation as well, right? So sorry, two or three different kinds of things are coming into being. One is the impact of Tantrism, right? Which brings into multiple things, basically the idea of mudra or matsya, or maithuna, sexual rights, or madira, which is alcohol, or basically, or then past grains. You have mudras, which are gestures, so all these kinds of things come into being with the tantrism thing. So these are the things which are coming into being towards the end of Gupta. They have started taking roots then, but become bigger in the Pala period, which is 8 to 12th century, or more importantly, say around 7th to 11th century or 12th century. Now, part of this also impacts Buddhism, but it's not as if you can say one-on-one correlation that this impacted this impacted this, but these are broadly cultural influences going on around this time, right? So if you look at it in terms of that, the idea of a Shakti cult, one of the manifestations of this Shakti cult in Buddhism was also the idea of coming into being of female deities, right? So the taras become important, right? Or female consorts become important. And there are other female deities which also come into being, basically, right? There are other, some very fierce female deities also come into being, right? So that explains the part about, female goddesses, or, in Buddhism, right? Now, and then, during the 7th to 11th century, what you also see is that Buddhism also gets, influenced by this idea of tantrism in a more significant way, and that is what is known as Vajrayana. Now, what does this mean, basically, right? What does this mean, or what kind of thing that it has for Buddhism? It means, and this is again, you've talked about Hinayana and Mahayana. Here in this case, you're talking about something which is very different. So during the Hinayana phase, you see that there's an element of a rigor, an element of being arhat, follow the teacher, strictly follow the rules. Two, in Mahayana, when the ideas of basically more beings attaining nirvana, the compassionate bodhisattvas, transfer of merit, all those elements come into being, and image worship is also coming into being. And now you enter a phase when it is said that the power lies in a magical, there's a magical power, right? And that lies in a vajra. So therefore vajrayana. So the idea is of taking control of that magical power. And as I said, that it comes through those things that I talked about, basically, right? It comes through a variety of things, through lots of initiations, lots of chants, lots of practices, and all those things that I talked to you about, the m's, basically the methuna, the matsya, the madira, right? All, there are five m's, in fact. So this is how comes. So there's a lot of Buddhism. What is coming into being is Buddhism is becoming more ritualistic. The idea is to take care of the magical power, which is called the Vajra or thunderbolt or diamond, right? And alongside that, there is a subtle thing that these deities do not have to be persuaded. These deities have to be controlled through a magical power. You control them, right? So there is a different dynamic at work as well, right? So through the magical power, so it's not as if you're just appeasing the deities.
So reverence is not there, control is there.
The parts of it, there's somewhere in between, basically the element of control is also taking, becoming ascendant, right? But it's obviously because ritualistic Mahayana is also flourish in, also existing in parts of it. And Nalanda, during this part, and let me just first complete that part and then move on to this. So you have that going on, and then so the taras are there, and then the mandala drawings are there. These are complex representations of Buddhist universe, keeping the Buddhist deity at the center, basically. So a set of circles and concentric circles or diagrams, basically 3D diagrams around that. So what you see are happening, taras are happening, the magical formula, the 6 m's are becoming, or 5 m's are becoming important, and then and then a different concept of Buddhism is coming into being. Now what happens then, right? And this is very strongly manifesting in the case of Nalanda. So from 7th to 11th century, it has two phases. The first phase is a Mahayana phase, which is becoming, ritualistic, more ritualistic. And then under the Palas, which is around 8th to 12th century, it is known as, so the Pala form of Buddhism is also known as the Vajrayana Buddhism, which becomes very important. Now, how does it manifest once you have a tantric form of Buddhism also happening, and one element of Shaivism which is closer to Tantrism is also the Bhairava sect, right? Now, in the case of Nalanda, what we do is that we, our entire framework of Nalanda has been to that it was university, the ancient university, which it was, basically a big flourishing university there was. And the other frame of looking at is it was completely destroyed by one Muslim invasion, basically one single invasion. Now, but other than that, we don't look at it in terms of a reconfiguration of a landscape, the sacred landscape, right? I know of a historian called Salila Kulsreshta who's worked on it as well, and then it's like reconfiguration. Now, what is happening? You have Vajrayana, you have Savisham in the form of Bhairava, you have Shakti worship as well. All things are existing, right? Now, it is unlikely that they are not mutually influencing each other, right? So in the latter phase at Nalanda, what you see is a blurring of religious boundaries, right? Deities, practices, rituals, all those start impacting each other. There is an intermixture of all those things. So how is it manifesting? At one level, you have already seen that happening slightly earlier and becoming important here is that within the Puranic order, within the epics and Purana, Buddha comes to be seen as one of those incarnations of Vishnu,
Yep.
right? So Buddha is one of those. So that is, in a way that is happening, right? And within the Shaivite order, basically, Bhairava is coming, closer to, some conceptualizations of Buddha as well, right? Now, how do you, there are three different kinds of manifestations of how this happened, right? How do you see it in terms of tangible heritage? At one level, very broadly, and then I'll come to three different examples, right? At one level, when you go to Nalanda, there is a place called, Temple 2. Temple 2 is basically a plinth. It used to be a big temple. So if you go to Temple 2, what you see now is only the remnants of a plinth, basically, right? But that platform, if you look at the images around that platform, you see images of Buddhist deities. You see images of deities belonging to the Shaivite pantheon. You see images of the deities belonging to the Vaishnavite pantheon. You see images of deities which belong to the popular cults like the Yakshas, Kubers, right? And you see deities which are, associated with the Shakti cult. So very complex cultural intermingling is happening, or assimilation is happening. And you would see pictures. Now you would see that Nalanda is an ancient Buddhist university. Why would deities be, shown there? And you would also see, scenes from epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, right? So you see there's a lot of assimilation going on, right? And within this assimilation, there are tensions as well. It is not as if this is, something which is completely, friendly, very friendly happening. So in some of the representations, right, you would see, that there is a tussle as well. If you look at, deities like Aparajita or Heruka, right, or some Buddhist representations where you would see the Buddhist deities are trampling Hindu deities, right? So there is a tension also going on, right? So this tension, when you see Trilok Vijaya or Aprajita or, Heruka, they seen as trampling. So there's a tension also going on, which is seen in the, again, as I said, the artifacts, and how I'm using those artifacts to basically talk about religion. So I'm using that, look, if you see those images that they are, see these kinds of figures of deities, they are, you see obviously this is a cultural intermingling going on, right? Within that, lots of giant Buddha statues are also getting invested with a new form, right? And there are three examples I'll give you here, right? One example is the one that you gave just now, which is basically a Buddhist statue which was discovered by Telhara, which is one of the surroundings, of Nalanda University, and then, brought to Bodh Gaya in the Telia Bhandar Bhairav Mandir. It's a black Buddha, right? Now, obviously, a Bhairav Mandir worshipping a Buddha means, that Buddha had come to assume the form of a Bhairav as well, or a kind of a protective deity in terms of Bhairav as well, right? There is another place where which is called Rukmini Haranasthan, right? So where, the image of Buddha represents, the Krishna, and the Bodhisattva accompanying Buddha also symbolizes Rukmini. So what would Buddha do in a Rukmini Haranasthan? And if you go to another place called Surajpur, you see in the temple image of a Surya god and the crowned Buddha, right? So obviously, these things go on to say that there's a lot of, as the, material remains tell you, there's a lot of intermingling going on. There's a lot of intermixture going on. There's a lot of cultural, whichever terms, anthropologists or sociologists use different terms to do that. But, the crux of these term, basically, or the developments is that there's a lot of intermingling happen, lot of cultural intermixing happen, right? So what you see and what it means for us, that, somewhere, once Nalanda had declined from its prime, right, One of the manifestations in that landscape is also that you see what is in terms of being called the reconfiguration of the sacred landscape. This is an area this surprises you, right? You have very close by, you have Kundalipur, you have Pavapuri, you have Bodh Gaya, you have Nalanda. This is very rich for you know Hindus. This is an area which is very rich for Buddhists. This is an area which is the birth and death place of Mahavira. So, and obviously they're all flourishing in the same part. So there
Yes.
is something which is very, very distinct about, very, very intriguing about this region. This is the region where the first set of empires come into being, the Magadha and the Maurya, slightly extended versions of this region. So there is something about this region which has to offer something to everyone. It has to offer something to the monarchs. It has to offer something from the communities of monks. It has to offer people for heterodox sects. It has to offer something for spiritual seekers. It has to offer something for trade. Because there are many people who are rich in trade and are donating. Basically, establishments to the Buddhist order. So then I say that is it possible to think in terms of a greater Nalanda there? Because only a very small part of that area has been excavated. And our knowledge about Nalanda is very limited, only based currently based on the excavated area. So I won't be surprised if our understanding of Nalanda gets changed once we have more excavations.
But haven't we had enough references by Hun Suang when he has mentioned and talked about Nalanda? Do you think what he has mentioned after he might have left that place, more developments would have happened?
Absolutely, because it was, when Sang we were talking about 7th century, Nalanda continues till about 13th century, right? So obviously, lots of developments are happening. And since you have mentioned Xuanzang, Huensang, who's now we call it and pronounce it as Xuanzang, two, three things that we need to be cautious about, right? As we say in the language of history, because here is a person who's come from China to collect scriptures, right? He's seeking, looking for original scriptures, right? And here is a person whose primary purpose is to collect scriptures. And then when he goes back, with loads and loads. It says that more than 650, uh, you know,
Manuscripts.
that he took back, right? And then what is also important to remember that he's not like a traveler taking notes. He's not a tourist taking notes of the different sites or copious notes that this was like this. And then he goes back, right? And after a few years, basically, he is asked by the emperor to prepare, put them together in a writing form, right? So he writes based on his memories. So his purpose was to collect scriptures. He was not something like an avid traveler who's taking copious notes. So to restrict our understanding purely about from one particular source, which
Yeah.
is what hampers our understanding of Nalanda,
Yes.
because we are trying to see Wen Sang as the source about Nalanda. And when you look at, as I said, these three, four ideas, they offer very different understandings of Nalanda. What we just discussed, in terms of uh, the the tantric systems that had come into place, or the Vajrayana systems, in terms of intermingling of boundaries, in terms of that what the remote sensing things reveals. So a lot of things have happened. And it also tells you about what we say something in history, that read the historian before you read her or his work. So that means
Yeah.
you need to be knowing what is the context that
Yeah.
she or he is coming from.
It could be biased. It could be
The bias, it could be of a different, it could be from a
fabricated.
different thing. Like Huen Sang is, coming from scripture's point. He's not something whose purpose is to document Nalanda.
And
And
his loyalty lies to his emperor, to his
he's
geography.
there, he's also a rebel that who's come against the wishes, basically of many, powerful people there. But then his purpose is not that. His purpose is to not record, and he goes to multiple places, all associated with Buddha. He's trying to collect scriptures. So that is what his foremost objective is. But if he use, obviously he'll be used of course, he can be one of those various sources of doing that, but it cannot be the source of understanding any particular site, right? Because then, and as you rightly said, even after Nalanda, even after Xuanzang, there are 5 6 other
Yeah,
centuries,
yeah.
and even after 5 6 other centuries, the whole idea of sacred landscape is changing.
So in Nalanda, Dr. Shashank, when you say Mahaviharas, Mahavihara does not mean university, right?
No, Mahavira does not mean university in a literal sense.
Ha.
Mahavira means a big vihara. Maha and vihara, right?
But it was also a residential university where there were courses offered and people used to come to take that, right? So Mahavihara is something which is greater than what we today know as a university, because it has the elements of university but much more. So you have people coming from all over the world taking courses not just in the philosophical and the religious belt, taking courses in other subjects as well. Do we have references? Okay, there were mathematics, there was science, there were astronomy, there was music. Were there other subjects as well taught and experimented and R&Ds which were happening in Nalanda apart from the confluences of various schools of philosophies? Do we have any evidences of that as well?
Yeah, we have it. But let me just give you a context about how to understand the
Yeah,
Mahavihara,
yeah,
because that will is where
yeah.
the fundamentals will lie, basically. So as Buddhism develops, you know, the first form of structures that had emerged, when Buddha was there, and it's an interesting point you have made, so that first understand the Mahavihara, and then we understand the second part of your question. So when during Buddha's times, the idea was that the monk should be wandering around, right, trying to preach religion, right? And the only time they became sedentary was during the rainy season. They were retreats. So Vesavas or Varsavas is what you call them. So they, during those days, they would seek refuge in bamboo or mango orchards, gardens or orchards, basically, right? And once the rainy season was done, they would again go back, resume this business about this, right? So in the Buddhist sacred landscape, you would see lots of vanas, like Venu Vana in Rajgir, which has now become a modern, multi-theme, Buddhist park, right? Or Jeta Vana in Shravasti, basically. So there are lots of vanas, or Ambapali Vana, or Jivaka Vana, right? Now these are the places where they have said, "Ki, okay, you come and stay here," and they would create structures out of bamboo, and then once the rainy season goes, again start going out. So that is the first stage. So these are early forms of viharas, what we understand as viharas. Gradually, as you move to the postmodern times, basically those whole early structures start coming up, right? And these structures are basically of two types: either independent standing, which is called the viharas, or as in which is you as in see you case of Sanchi or other places, or you have something like in Ajanta where you see as a part of cave things, a part of the caves. So you have dug the viharas out of the caves, right? So then this is the second stage where they are more permanent dwellings, basically, right? It also denotes a stage in the settlement of the monks, greater settlement of the monks, but the purpose still remains religious or spiritual, rather say, let's say spiritual. So you dwell, most of the discussions are around, the faith, the Dhamma, right? And these are also used as residential units. So residential units and talk about Dhamma or Dhamma, right? Teachings of Buddha and the philosophies, there. These are the two purposes that they have. And the objects of veneration are basically either the stupas or gradually chaityas which had started coming into being. So when we talk about the post-modern times or the Gupta times, these images or representations of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in human forms come into being, and they are also being placed in temples, right? Coming also closer to our idea of or the other idea about basically bhakti, right, where you have a devotion to a god, basically, right? So so these temples are also coming into being, which came to be known as chaityas. So the Buddhist temples, so there is a difference between the chaityas, which are stupas, which are objects of veneration, and the viharas, which are objects where you settle down, where you deliberate, where you take rest, and where you follow the rules of the monks, basically, right? Then, what it starts happening, and this starts happening somewhere around the 5th, 6th centuries, right? First, that interesting development which it happens is in case of certain monasteries like Nalanda, which happens more later 6th century onwards, uh, and in case of Ajanta, Bagh, and all, right? Which is that as soon as you enter the monastery, you see on the right opposite wall there is a niche in which a statue or image is of Buddha is placed, right? Now, this is the place so far, so the whole architecture is changing, right? You are placing the image of what had come to, kind of assume a kind of a divine status by now, in a place that you reside. Whereas I'm talking about a binary between the chaityas or the temples where you worship them, right? Or the stupas. Here in the monastery, you see, figurative representations of Buddha and a chamber, basically being, occupied by Buddha, right? Now, this is a very, interesting development in the career of Buddhism or Buddhist architecture or in the career of viharas, which means that it is no longer just a place to reside, but has also brought in the element of worship as well. So these monasteries have become Chaitya cum Vihara. They are these monasteries where you have this, that niche where the Buddha occupies. Now, this has an interesting, history. In the first phase, this history, there are elements of this thing at Shravasti or Banaras, basically, where there are inscriptions which talk about, room occupied by Buddha, which is, it was believed, right? Later, this time that I'm 5th century onwards, and this that the sites I'm talking about, they are now called Gandhakutis or perfume chambers, right? Where the Buddha is supposed to reside. And in Nalanda or other places, you also have inscriptions where properties are being given to Buddha, not a room occupied by Buddha. It is called Buddha's chamber now. So, as opposed to a room occupied or meant for Buddha, you now have Buddha's chamber. So, he is believed to be one of the residents of the vihara, as a result of which the viharas become the Chaitya cum viharas, right? So, this is one development. Now, I'm coming to, so, and there in the case of Nalanda, there were groups of monks called Gandhakuti Varikas who were interested with maintaining those things. And between two Gandhakutis, they could enter into business transactions, right? So there were interaction between two Gandhakutis as well, right? So even belonging to different monasteries. So there's property being given to Buddha. All the donations are being given to Buddha, right? So and then these perfume chambers or Gandhakutis could have correspondence with each other. They had seals, they had all kinds of things. So there's a lot of interaction, professional interaction happening between two Gandhakutis as well. Very interesting. And then I come to the second part of it, which is your idea of vihara. From in transitioning between viharas to mahaviharas, what is happening is it is a conglomeration of monasteries, right? But the function has changed in two or three different ways. Here it is not just monks, not just basically residential, but also scholastic, right? So this is a becomes a place not just for spiritual exchange or talking about dhamma. It also become a place where monks have come to settle down and study, involved in serious metaphysics, involved with philosophy, right? Second, it is not just limited to the monks only. There are people outside who could come as well, right? Third, it is not just limit, though it was a center of important center of Mahayana learning and later of the Vajrayana thing as well. But there are subjects which are taught about which are much beyond Buddhism. So it talks about coming together of humanities and social sciences and sciences. So things like metallurgy or astronomy, or medicine, all those is being talked about. So this becomes a center, and this is one of the things that if this kind of a arrangement can only work if somebody is financing it, because the monks are no longer financing it, right? They're not going and arranging stuff for themselves. So it works hugely on royal patronage or donations, from this. If the donations are stopped, establishment would also start dwindling, right? So this has become a center. This Mahavihara has opened up gates to, it's no longer a kind of a spiritual center, basically it is a spiritual center, but goes much beyond that, right? Open gates to much wider discussions, not just limited to Buddhism, has humanities, social sciences, and sciences coming into play, right? So it has a much bigger scope, and where the monks have settled down as opposed to wandering about. So, and it is an aggregation of viharas, not just one vihara. So
So,
that is how you would see the Mahavihara.
so would it be safe to say that Nalanda, from a perspective, if you look at the general perspective, was first of its kind university as well, historically speaking, anywhere that existed?
Absolutely, there's no doubt about that. This is a very different kind of a establishment, Mahavihara, and we talk about that. There are many modern historians which talk about that it was, ancient, Oxford or a Harvard or a NASA or things like that.
So it's not exaggeration. It's not exaggeration if somebody is saying that it was at that level in terms of the kind of subjects and the teachers and the R&Ds and the discoveries that were happening over there.
Absolutely. Nalanda had, basically a very high level of, not only that, Nalanda also had a very, something which goes unnoticed, is that Nalanda had a tradition of preparing manuscripts, right? So many of those manuscripts, and manuscripts, you copy some manuscript, you engrave some manuscripts, you prepare some manuscripts. So in a way, it is also doing, what, publishing is a modern word, but there's also an element, which comes closer to this idea, modern idea of publishing. So it is a place where you're producing texts as well,
So
right? So
i-
writing,
if
so
not
modern,
if not printing, they were doing it
different ways
manually.
they are doing manually, basically. So what you're doing, there is a group of monks perhaps preparing that,
Yeah,
basically,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So if you compare it with a modern university system, right, which is unfair, but just to put it, to simplify it matters, here there is teaching, there is research, there is publication, right? To put it in very simplistic terms, though the language that we use for those times are different,
Got it.
and the forms they take are much different.
So basically, we were the Vishwaguru. We were that. I mean, in this respect, this is basically something that sprouted from the land and it spread everywhere. This is the knowledge which actually spread and grew. So Dr. Shashank, this brings me to two questions. How did then this entire learning ecosystem of Nalanda and the Mahaviharas decline in Indian geography, not globe, in Indian geography? And what happened? Is it true that all these there was the burning of the great Nalanda library, which went on for so many months because so many manuscripts were lost? So please talk to us about the decline of such institutions in our own region, and where did all the books go then? How did we as Indians lose something that was indigenous? Something that was so great.
See, the books part of the manuscripts I just talked about, lot of them went to Tibet, lot of
Different
them went
places.
to
ठीक
China,
है.
lot of them to different places, because there is a lot of movement of monks are
ठीक है.
coming. And lot of movements of monks have started coming during 12th and 13th century, because they are realizing that something is becoming unstable, right? So, movement of monks in, Bodh Gaya, movements of monks in Nalanda in 13th, 14th century, right up to, that are happening. They are taking, manuscripts, so things this. Now, one of the reasons that you do is basically that, it is said that, and this is, one of the theories, that it was, raided by the Turks in basically Bakhtiyar Khalji, right? And interesting bit is that, the popular theory talks about one sudden cataclysmic attack. Yet in one attack, everything was burned down, right? Now, if you were to ask me that did the Turks contribute to the decline of Nalanda, I would say yes. My answer is yes, but not in the way in which it is popularly described. So, how do we see it, as historians? As historians, we see sources, basically, right? And the two sources that talk about the decline of Nalanda, both are written in the aftermath, right? So there is one source which is, something around, say, middle of 13th century, which talks about a decline, attack on Bihara, right? And the other is basically, which is a kind of a Persian source, right? Which is called Tabakat-e-Nasiri, right? Written by a person called Minhaju Siraj Juzani, right? And the second one are basically Tibetan texts which are written, 400, 500 years later, right? So the first set of texts, Tabakat in Nasiri, talks about decline at the hands of the, Bakhtiyar Khalji. Now, interesting bit is that, that this is a person who is based in a court of a sultan of Delhi Sultanate, Nasiruddin Mahmud, right? Jujani is based there. He says that he went to, Lakhnauti, where he met two soldiers who told him about an attack on a Bihar, and where he says that, the people who were inhabiting the Bihar were basically shaven, the heads were shaven, and they were all killed. And later they discovered that it had lots of books and manuscripts, right? So this is it. And later they learned that, these places are known as Bihar, basically, right? So the exact words that is used is the fortress of Bihar, but the word Nalanda is nowhere used, right? And the general inclination of historians is to assume that, it was, Odantapura, which is, if you were to, broadly locate it, it is in the modern Bihar Sharif, which is closer to Nalanda. So they say that it was, Udantapura as opposed to this thing. And, when, Dhamma Swami, the Tibetan traveler who comes in 13th century, he says that while that was converted into a Turkish garrison as in Udantapura, Nalanda, the teaching had resumed, So there is a person, monk called Rahul Sribhadra, who is, trying to revive the thing with a smaller number of students, right? So a monk is trying to revive the tradition of Nalanda, right? That's, and that it is, it has not declined. So some element of teaching is still happening, right? The second part is basically which locates it in terms of, basically the animosity between the Brahmins and the Buddhists. So it is said that, some Brahmins who had gone there, were humiliated by the Buddhist monks, as a result of which, they, set the monasteries on fire, basically, right? Now, how does it, how does it matter here, basically, right? Because, that is, so one say that it is miraculously produced fire, right? And some of them, they say that some learned Surya Sadhana, which took years, and then, they set it on fire, right? So that is the case. Now, if you look at, the whole idea of Nalanda, I'm also talking about, that there is no, even in the Buddhist tradition, there's no thing which is saying that, it was, uh, ravished, that it met the hands and, sudden cataclysmic decline. So the idea of a sudden cataclysmic decline is not supported by the sources. So then what could have happened? What could have happened is, there's no denying this part, and this is what I'm coming to you when I said that if you ask me broadly, that did the Turks contribute? Yes, they did. So this is an area, both Gaya, Nalanda, all this area has come under the influence of the Turks, right?
Yeah.
And they are making raids, basically. So when you make rates, and so all the old patrons, basically, remember, in some point of the discussion, I said ki Nalanda could only, because the Buddhist monks have settled down, they are
Yeah.
studying now.
Yes.
They are in teaching, research, all those kinds of things. So that kind of an ecosystem means that you need to have sponsors, somebody who's giving you donation, somebody who's giving you endowments, right, can only survive on the basis of that. So if you have frequent depredations or raids in that region, the political stability is no longer there, right? It needed somebody like an Ashoka or a Kanishka to bring stability and to patronize the Nalanda. Nobody was there on the scene, right? So all this, raids and deprivations, what they raids and basically in that region, what they brought about is political instability, right? The rulers have started, the rulers who would traditionally have patronized the establishment have become, unsettled.
The financing got cut completely because they
The
were replaced
sponsorship
by.
gets so there's nobody to finance or sponsor the regions, basically. As I said, it needed somebody like an Ashoka or a Kanishka.
And,
These things,
and the invaders would not follow the school of thought of Buddhism
they
because
would
they
not
come from
follow
their
the school
own
of thoughts of
Abrahamic
Buddhism,
religion. Yeah.
right? So so there, all those people who are responsible for maintaining, they are, so political stability brings about all, erupts, disrupts all the forms of patronage as well. So gradually, and also remember that, around this time, other Mahaviharas are also coming into being, like, as I talked about Somapura, Jagdala, Udantapura, Vikramashila, and some of them, the masters of some of those Mahaviras are also are masters of Nalanda. So obviously Nalanda is giving way to other Mahaviharas as well,
Yeah. Yeah.
while it is retaining its own place in the Buddhist ecosystem, knowledge transmission ecosystem. There are other things which are equally, these Mahaviharas were very, very, big centers, themselves, of the Vajrayana form of learning. And many of those, Vajrayana things that we learn now is about that. So, yes, this is how it comes into being. But the decline is a more complicated process than
Yeah.
what we have, assumed to be.
Dr. Shashank, now we come to a very important aspect, and which is explain now. You have written in the book about Buddhism 2.0. So I am going to club two things over here. Tell me about Buddhism 2.0, and now also tell me about the role of the West in either revivalism of Buddhism or propagation of Buddhism or whatever. So I want to combine 2.0, Buddhist 2.0, also considering the lens of the West and where we are right now as a product of these two things.
Both of them require long discussions, because the West is, it comes as a separate chapter. But let me talk to you Buddhism 2.0.
Yeah.
Buddhism 2.0, I thought, it is a kind of a very modern version of Buddhism that we see. So post independence, there are three areas, four areas roughly, right? So the first part is basically when it is used in the matters of statecraft. So the first prime minister, Nehru, uses Buddhism and India's, primacy in Buddhism to, strengthen India's position in the neighborhood of Asian countries, basically. So it's like a cultural superpower, trying to show that we gave Buddha to the world. So there is a relic diplomacy going on. You go and give relics that, oh, okay, this is Buddha's relics, And one point of time, there was this fear that the relics would be exhausted.
Yeah. Yeah.
We won't have the relics, so
Yeah.
you have given it to everybody, right? So one is a kind of Buddhism being used in statecraft, right, as a kind of a soft power tool, right? And it is with this idea in mind that Nehru, decides to celebrate Buddha Jayanti in a very big way. So 1956, while Ambedkar is, converting en masse to Buddhism, is also a very important year for Buddhism, in the sense that, the Buddha Jayanti that were organized in Bodh Gaya were organized in a very big way. Lot of foreign, dignitaries were given invitations, right? Lot of, heads of Asian states came to, Bodh Gaya, right? As a kind of a, which is basically marked the 2,500 years of Buddha's, parinirvana or Mahaparinirvana, right? After that, the government decides to allot land. They set up an advisory board and decide to allot land to Asian countries to construct their temples or monasteries, right? So what you see is that 70s and 80s, lot of foreign countries start erecting their monasteries and temples, right? And after 80s, basically they start constructing them, or whenever they do any renovation, they do it in their own architectural style. And 80s, they were also asked to use their own architectural style tradition. So if you go to Bodh Gaya now, you will see why is it that I see something which is a Thai architectural temple, a kind of a Bangladeshi style, or kind of a Tibetan style, or kind of a Chinese style of temple, basically with Chinese style of Buddhas, with Chinese styles of arts and things like that. That was because that we encouraged it as a matter of a statecraft, right? So it's a part of our diplomacy that we are allowing the land. So in some descriptions of Nalanda, and when I talk about that, how the Mahabodhi temple complex and the areas around it have become saturated with Buddhist establishments, and also representing some kind of a mini Asia, right? That is one side of it. Parallelly, what is also happening is, as I told you some time back, is about Ambedkar, that how Buddha gets involved with this idea of about identity politics, and this is idea of equality and Ambedkar right Buddhist, basically, right? The third thing also I talked about briefly sometime in the part of my thing is that how with the coming of uh, Dalai Lama. But how with the coming of Dalai Lama, what you also see is that how MacLeodganj becomes the center of this government, Tibetan government in exile, right? And how the UNHR's UNHCR basically worked with the Indian government to set up Tibetan establishments, right? More than 50 Tibetan establishments were established in different parts of the country, the largest number then being in Karnataka, right? And also how both Gaya, Tibet, they all have formed a part of sacred geography, right? And how Tibetan Buddhist has, India has become a rallying point for many of those Tibetan Buddhists who are settled here. And in the form of Dalai Lama, what has also happened is because he has become a global figure. So Tibetan Buddhism has also enhanced the role of Indian Buddhism, also giving it a more globalized shape, right? So sometimes the Buddhism in India also you know it's not so or let me put it this way, that Tibetan Buddhism gives a more global character, because of the presence of Dalai Lama. He's going around, he has linkages with the West, he's traveling around in multiple countries, he's performing Kala Chakra Tantras, basically here, the ceremonies, so the lot of things. So the cause of Tibetan Buddhists, which India has chose to patronize, has also given a global version to the Buddhism that was prevalent in India,
And
right?
I think this has gone in India's favor as well, that India is also trying to use Buddhism also as a soft power now that the Dalai Lama is in India only.
India's has been a long doing that. After the independence, it has been doing that, and even the Shri Narendra Modi also has emphasized that how he has been having these global summits, Buddhist global summits, basically, and he's been visiting these important sites and telling how Buddhism can serve as a kind of a global reference point for many of those
Makes
things that
sense.
we have learned about Buddhism as well, right?
Makes sense.
So that kind of thing. And the fourth part in Buddhism 2.0 is that how it has got integrated with also something which is very different, which is this whole idea of tourism,
Yeah.
right? So statecraft, identity politics, diaspora and refugees, and tourism. So Buddha centered tourism has become big, basically, right? And in the process we are also inviting lots of diplomatic powers in modern countries as well, in modern times as well. So you have structures created by Japan in multiple cities, basically Japanese agencies getting involved with restoration work in many places. So it is become a very vibrant place, right? So this is what Buddhism do, because here we are not talking about monks, and we are not talking about Buddha and Buddhists, or Hinayana, Mahayana, or Vajrayana, or this. We are talking about very completely different set of
Yes.
things, which is
Yes.
not what our traditional understanding of Buddhism is about.
Yeah.
We are talking about statecraft, we are talking about diaspora politics, we are talking about identity politics, we are talking about tourism. So therefore, I call it Buddhism 2.0.
Yeah. Dr. Shashank, about the West part, very quickly, two parts. A, why do you think, why do you think Buddhism resonated so much with the Western audience? And B, how the West is playing a role, be it political, be it strategical, be it of whatever form, how is West, briefly playing a role in the revival of Buddhism? But first, I want to understand what attracted them, how this thing really, they actually embraced it more than they have embraced their own culture. Sometimes I feel.
So there are, from time to time, it's largely in the context of 19th century. So from time to time, you have, very different kinds of, approaches, or very different kinds of frames that have, attracted West, right? So the first, being, basically that, there was this romantic tradition in the West, basically, right? In, say late 18th century, early 19th century, it talks about ruins. So there are people who are coming and seeing ruins and parts of Buddhist ruins, and so if you have heard about, these uncle and the nephew, Daniels, so they have drawn some of those finest sketches of Buddhist sites, basically, right? Then there is this thing about, how do you study religions? And the dominant Western thing was that you study religion because you study through text, right? But within that, before that, there was this obsession with the figure of Buddha, because they wanted to prove that it was, they were trying to interrogate first, and there were lots of questions coming to Western mind. See, they are establishing political control in India, right? And when they are trying to establish political control in India, they are trying to tell us that, look, we can help you also understand your historical traditions, which is not a correct case to make or correct appointment to make. But they are continuously telling us that, look, we'll also tell you what your true history has been, right? And somewhere they were not very, convinced about the Brahmanical structures, in the first part of it, because they think it has got to do more with divine and things like that. So they were looking for a human figure.
Okay.
Now, in the West, the picture is going on, but is Buddha a god, or is Buddha a social reformer? Because the idea of social reformer comes closer to the idea of Christianity as well, right? Where they talk about social reforms and many other things. So there are many questions going on. Is Buddha a social reformer? Is Buddha a god? Right? Then the question is Buddha born in India, or is there is one Buddha or two Buddha? One is a god and one is a social reformer. Is Buddha born in India, or Mongolia, or in Africa? And finally, when they start studying text, because the dominant classical framework of studying a religion in the West was to study the text. So they first study the Sanskrit text, and then they study the Pali text, and then they come to this idea that no, it's a human. It's a human being, right? Who has philosophies, So all those things which were in air, basically start coming together, right? And then it middle of 19th century, you see archaeology as a discipline coming up. Now, what the West does, or in this case, British do, is say that, okay, we will use some of those enlightened disciplines to help you understand your own history. So one of those dominant thrust in archaeology after Cunningham become the head of Archaeological Survey of India in 1871 or 18 basically 1860s 70s basically, is that they're trying to locate the historical Buddha, the human Buddha, right? So then in the later part of 19th century, there's also this movement in the West which talks about world religions and the holy lands, right? So if there is a Mecca, if there is a Jerusalem, there should be some kind of thing for Buddha as well,
Yeah.
right? And during that, there's a gentleman called Edwin Arnold who wrote The Light of Asia. So he wrote The Light of Asia, and he argued in terms of Bodh Gaya being the land of the Buddhists, basically. And his publication of The Light of Asia was a roar, in those times, 1879. right? It created an uproar in the market, basically. It entered into several translations, several editions, basically. So it is said that his book did what centuries could not do. So it's like, doing that. And also, remember one other thing that we forget is that, 1893 is also the World Parliament of Religions where Vivekananda went to Chicago. There's another person who had gone there, right? Who is Dharmapala Anagarika, who was established the Mahabodhi Society,
Sri
came
Lankan.
over, Sri Lankan, right? And he, so the West is getting, at different points of time, it through different kinds of sources. And once the archaeologically establish itself is there, and then once it, basically in India, when you start discovering the sites, then this are started putting order to, the fragmented knowledge. Okay, there's one Buddha, he is a human being, and there are sites. This is how it was published, and this is how this, thing is spreaded. It spread to other regions from the Gangetic heartland. So this all this picture starts coming into being. Interested, you'd be interested to that Marco Polo did their first history of Buddhism,
Yeah.
in China in 13th century.
When he was
So
in the
yes,
Genghis Khan's court.
so then, basically what he's doing is that, the West's engagement is long, but, in 19th, 20th century it becomes, higher.
I
So
have
that's
to ask you one more question, which I want your perspective from someone like you who's a scholar as well, because a lot of speculations are going on. So let me narrate this thing. There is this very famous Hollywood movie called The Man from Earth. In that movie, towards the end, a group of people come to know that one of their colleagues, who's also a professor in the same college as they are, is Jesus Christ. He is living, he has not died. And when one of his colleagues asks him that if you are Jesus Christ, I want to ask you, what was your message? What is it that you wanted us to follow and do? And you know what he says? He said, all I wanted was to spread the knowledge of the Buddha. Because when I went to India, I met this man. And what a magnificent man he was. And the things he taught me and the things he showed me is what I wanted to replicate in the West, but I was not able to do it. There is another book, I'm forgetting the name of the author. There is another book, I'm forgetting the name of the author. That book's name is Jesus Lived in India, in which again they say, and they work on this case, that he indeed studied heavily. He went to Tibet, he was in Kashmir, he was in India, he heavily studied the Buddhist texts, the Buddhist religions, because Buddha predates the Christ. And he was amazingly impressed with Buddhism, and somehow it also reflects in his teachings when he came back. So I want to understand, do we have any historicity, any historical claims, evidences, references of such interactions of Jesus Christ with the teachings of the Buddha in this geography?
not that I have come across. Not that I have come across. So, it would be unfair on my part to suggest something that I haven't read or researched upon. So, not that I have come across, basically. But yes, I understand, there are claims being made, but I haven't come across that. And my focus wasn't that, because that would need a separate level of research altogether about how you do that. My focus was on basically, as I say, casting the Buddha means,
Yeah.
it means every form in which Buddha or the idea of the Buddha was casted literally, either in an extended sense or in an imagined sense or in a symbolic sense, or in any form in which Buddha was imagined, either in an extended or imagined or symbolic form. So, and by extension of Buddha, you see the ideas related to manuscripts. So it was had a very focused thing,
Yeah.
basically. So
Yeah.
that's how.
And just ending this thing with this thing. So what, again coming back, so do you also credit the Western civilization as well to bringing the Buddha again back in the forefront? Because I see a lot of people getting inspired by the philosophy, a lot of books are getting written by them, a lot of Westerners are getting incorporated in their monks. Vipassana, as I was talking on phone with you, has become a global sensation because of a lot of Western people are also adapting it. Something similar they did with Hatha Yoga. And yoga is, I see them doing with the Buddhist ecosystem as well. So your final thoughts on their
Uh,
contribution?
See, it would be wrong to credit this to the West, because Buddhism, as I said, did not disappear completely from India,
Yeah, yeah,
right? So this whole idea about when we talk about that Buddhism disappeared, it never completely disappeared. I
yeah,
can give you examples like the Tabo monastery, the Lahore Spiti Valley, the Kinnaur Valley, which had Buddhism flourishing right from 8th 9th century onwards till current times. Then you see this region which after partition became Bangladesh, or first East Pakistan and then Bangladesh, which is the Bengal region. Lot of evidences about flourishing Buddhist tradition there. Then you have in Tibet, which was, and then the Newari Buddhist in Nepal, basically. So there is a lot in terms of still happening. Then in at the level of ideological thing as well, I talked about how Purana, Buddha had become incorporated in the Puranas as well. And there is a lot of conversations which are happening in Buddhist hagiographies or commentaries on Buddhism, which talk about Buddhism, right? And it is, and also in Tamil devotional poetry. So Buddha continued to remain a part of public conversations, right? And then when you see, so he is there in the tangible form, he's remained in the and it is in the in say, so there's already before this thing has happened. And when East India Company came, all these reports and memoirs and the journals like Asiatic Researches, or Royal Asiatic Society of Mumbai, or Indian Antiquary, they are producing a wealth of literature on on the Buddhist things. So well before Edwin Lutyens 1879 Light of Asia is published, there is a full conversation going on in this thing. How it gets help is with the introduction of English, because many of those in English educated elites start taking up conversing it in more visible forms, basically, right, in Bengal, in elsewhere. And then they use their own networks of professional organizations like the Brahmo Samaj, the Pratna Samaj, the Theosophical Society, the Bengal Buddhist Association, the Chittagong Buddhist Association. All of them start spreading this idea. And then also you see that Rabindranath Tagore and Abhinavanath Tagore also using Buddhism or Buddhism in art forms, basically, and interacting more on the Japan side of it. 1930s 40s, it also gets interestingly linked with the left and the right, basically. So Dharmanand Kosambi or Rahul Sankrityayan, basically talk about Buddhism more in context of being social equality, is a tool of social equality. And then Hindu Mahasabha is also uh, posting how
yeah.
Buddha is a part of the Hindu tradition, right? And Birla is established Birlas are establishing rest houses and guest houses along all Buddhist estates. So it was coming back, basically, right? So while you are having developments in the West, you are also having an
Yeah.
Buddhism. And more importantly, one of the points to remember is that when the British archaeologists came to visit sites in India or to explore sites in India, it is the Brahmin Pandits who they would say that, right, please show me the site. And it is the Pandits, basically, who are showing them the sites. So how would they know? They had some knowledge of that. So Buddha had continued to remain, not in the forms that we would like to imagine, but had continued to remain a part of the public conversation, had continued to remain as a part of tangible heritage in some parts. And then so it was coming back to the forefront. So it is like recentering of Buddhism, that sense of the term. So the
Okay.
West was talking about. So, and even when they're talking about whether Buddha is a human, whether or a god, here we have this big engagement with Buddhism. So it is incorrect to say
Makes
that
sense. Yeah,
it offers a new set of
yeah.
energy, in the sense that our interactions with the West helps the positioning of Buddhism in the West, basically, or gives it a more globalizing appeal. But it would be incorrect to give the credit.
Completely give them the credit. Yeah, makes sense.
Absolutely.
Dr. Shashank, with this, we come to the end of the interview and the podcast. I hope you enjoyed our conversation, and I hope we were able to do justice to the core
Yeah,
matter
yeah,
of the book.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And my best wishes for the program, basically.
Thank you, Dr. Shashank.